This is Duke University.
My name's Melinda Wiggins. I'm 44. I was born in LaFleur County, Mississippi. The town that most things happen in LaFleur County is Greenwood. So that's where I went to school and my family worked and we went to church, but I actually lived outside of the town in the county in, I don't even know what it is, a pueblo or a village or something called Phillipston, which is just a community of about 400 or 500 people. Outside at the time when I was growing up, Greenwood had about 20,000. So very rural, very agricultural, not much happening in terms of a young kid's perspective, in terms of, fun things. I grew up on my grandparents' cotton farm. So both my parents' families were in agriculture and they were both sharecroppers. My mom's family did sharecropping. They moved from eastern Mississippi, close to Alabama, the hills, to the Delta, and really not far from where we live now. I actually visited the homestead, or really close to where my mom was born when I was visiting for Christmas. We were going to Sky Lake, this area that's a huge bald cypress virgin forest that had been discovered that actually Tom Rankin told me about, and I was telling my mom, I was like, because I've decided every time I go home I'm going to do one thing fun at least. So I was like, we're going to go to this virgin cypress forest, it'll be beautiful. I was telling my mom, she's like, oh yeah, your grandparents are buried there. So we went there. It was about 20 minutes from where I grew up, and we passed by like a little gravel road. My mom's like, I was born down that road. So they moved to the Delta, but then they were actually relocated to the area where I lived through a program in the 30s for sharecroppers who were able to buy land. So my grandparents were able to stop moving and working on other people's land, and they got a loan from the government to buy this 100+ acre farm. Every year I knew when cotton was going to bloom. I loved it when cotton was in bloom. It's beautiful. So yeah, the cycle of cotton was sort of the cycle of our life there. I didn't, and my mom would tell stories of working in the fields when she was a kid. She wasn't born when they were sharecropping. She was born when they had settled. And she was the baby, so she would always just tell stories, tell jokes about how she didn't have to do much work. So that was sort of the narrative I heard, is that, yeah, it's hard, but she doesn't really, everybody's like, yeah, but she doesn't really know. She didn't really have to pull her weight in cotton. And the family hired, or my grandparents hired African-American day laborers to work alongside my family because they needed more labor than they had children. They don't really talk about that much. My grandparents lived in a sharecropper home. I found out fairly recently, a couple years ago, when I was reading an oral history of that community of Phillipston, that African Americans had been displaced because of this program. So it was sort of this redistribution of land program where, 200 communities were created like Phillipston, where people were able to buy land and stop being sharecroppers. But in the process, other people were displaced.
So, what was the transition like moving to North Carolina, and what brought you here?
Lord, I didn't even visit before I came. One of the things about being working class is my parents said, you apply to the school that you want to go to. You don't, because it's expensive to apply. So I did, for college and grad school, I applied to one school, and thank God I got in. So, when I had gone to Millsaps, a small college in Jackson, Mississippi, and I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got out of school. I'd studied political science. I'd really been politicized in college. My professors, one of them was from Africa, And, you know, it was anti-apartheid movement going on then. I got involved with that on campus. My other professor had been very involved with the civil rights movement. He was blacklisted during the civil rights movement. They were pretty instrumental in sort of helping me learn, relearn, unlearn all kinds of things about the history of civil rights in the Delta and throughout the world, really. And that professor, whose name is John Quincy Adams, no lie, political science professor, he's like, have you ever thought of Divinity School? And I was like, nope, not at all, because I knew I didn't want to be a minister. I didn't want to work in a church setting. But he knew that I was spiritual, and I come from a religious community, and just asked me, you know, thought that I might look into it, because he's like, there's a lot of social justice work that people of faith are involved in, and that some divinity schools sort of facilitate or harbor. So I wanted to go to a university in the South. I wanted to go to a divinity school that was connected to a major university. It kind of narrows it tremendously. Believe it or not, Duke was the cheapest. I don't know if they still do this, but at the time they paid half of my tuition. They paid half of Duke students' tuition, so I went for half price. So it was an easy decision, because I was paying for myself and knew I'd have to take out loans or whatever. So I came unseen. When I came to Duke was when I was moving into Durham. The one thing that I did know is that I couldn't do direct services, because working in a homeless shelter, it felt like a lot of Band-Aids on the problem, and I didn't really see any systemic change. So the other thing it started helping me think about was just sort of what's causing this, right? Why is there a homeless population? Why is there a need for this? So it was pushing me a little bit beyond service. I think a lot of young people, or in my experience, I got connected to issues initially through service, like you do community service, you do volunteer stuff, or whatever. And so it was one of those, you know, moments like many folks have, which is you start to think about that model and critique that model and think about, am I having any change here? Is there any, you know, are we addressing the root causes of this problem? So I think it pushed me. I don't know, at that time I had no idea I was going to work with farm workers. I didn't know what farm workers were. I didn't know they were still working in the fields by then. But I did start looking at, okay, how do people think about systemic change, and where is their work that addresses systemic issues? I can't run a shelter. I knew that. It was very, Lord, I don't know how people do it. It was, you know, it's very trying too, just in terms of you seeing issues not resolved and folks not able to get out of the stream.
So how did you first become involved with SAS?
I did the internship. I did SAS internship. You know, I was, when I was a student, people still flyered. I don't know if that's the way. It was no electronic means at that point. I saw a flyer on Duke's campus about the Into the Fields internship, and frankly, I really didn't believe that there were people still working in the fields, because in the Mississippi Delta, even though I grew up on a farm, everything's mechanized there. You know, there aren't folks working in the fields there anymore. Cotton's mechanized, has been for a long time. So I looked into it out of curiosity. I studied a little Spanish, thought, you know, all the staff at SAF joke now that we would not be accepted into the internship should we apply right now. The qualifications and the competition is such that it was good I was in on the early. I was in the first class before there was a lot of competition for the program. But yeah, and I worked down in Newton Grove, pretty close to where you're from, a little bit farther east, with the Episcopal Farmworker Ministry. And so it was interesting because it combined some church-related work. One of my projects was to research what people of faith in North Carolina were doing with farm workers. So was there any response to an increase of Spanish-speaking farm workers in their community? And I was also helping folks with immigration applications. So I was educated very quickly about issues around facing immigrants and the whole application process to adjust your status. think that sometimes just the universe puts things together for you. I think I'd just been going toward this path in terms of, and then when it was there, I just said yes, like this is where I'm supposed to be, kind of thing. Because I mean, I felt so drawn to it because, again, people's stories. I mean, some people that I met that summer working, working with SAF, talking with farm workers about the situation. And then through SAF, I think the really good thing that we do is we contextualize it all for folks. So then I was also learning how this was part of a long narrative in our country and in the South, and for me in the Delta, of how we've produced our food and how we've treated workers and how we've treated people of color. And I felt like this is my story, and I have both an obligation to I don't really love that term, but I haven't found a better one. But, I have benefited from all of the things that our agricultural system continues to present that exploits people very directly. I mean, I grew up on a plantation. It's like, it feels, I can't go there and not know how deeply my privilege has taken me away from that story. So there is that. Obligation's not quite right. But, I just feel like, I have a strong sense of fairness, and I have a strong belief in equality and dignity in the workplace. And I was just pretty overwhelmed by what I learned and saw in terms of what's happening with agricultural workers. There's experiences that I've had that are both with migrant workers that are here for temporary basis to work in the fields, and the other powerful experience that I've had since that's kept me in this is a lot of relationships with students from farmworker families. So, the direct outreach, that summer I remember one house we visited actually with a woman who lived there alone with her kids, who was working in the fields and taking care of her kids, and she lived right in the middle of the tobacco field. So I felt like there was this affinity there, and she's working to take care of her kids, and there's nowhere for her kids to go, and she's working. And we went there and had a lovely exchange with her that wasn't about a complaint she was going to file or something she was going to change. It was just this human interaction, just like you would have with any other person. She's offering pretty much food and drink she doesn't have to share. And she's pretty open with what her problems are, though, with what's going on. And I think the experience was I connected with her daughter. Kids like me. I think it's because I'm little. They think I'm little, I think. But so her daughter and I had a little connection. But, again, I reflect a lot on experiences, and it wasn't anything monumental. It wasn't like she told this incredible, crazy, exploitative example. It was a normal example of what farm workers face every day. It was a routine example of abuse. It wasn't anything egregious, but it was the routineness of it in her demeanor and sharing it with us that had such a powerful effect on me. Because I was like, for her, this is her daily work. Just like I remember my parents. It's just like, if I tell you some of the things they've experienced, you would be like, you gotta be kidding me. But for them, it was just like, this is it. This is part of it. I gotta do this for my family. This is the way it is. I'm telling you, I need to get it off my chest. I'm not doing anything about it. I can't risk. Just sort of the routineness of exploitation. And when workers get to that place where they've lost some hope in changing it, that I think affected
Produced by Duke University.